Professor Tinkler, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So your paper focuses on potential effects of sexual harassment training. Is sexual harassment training common?
Yes, sexual harassment training became sort of a popular way for most organizations to respond to basically the threat of lawsuit in the 1990s. And so very large organizations tend to have sexual harassment training. And it's sort of a common way to make sure that all employees learn about what is appropriate and what's inappropriate in the workplace. That said, there are a lot of organizations that don't have sexual harassment training. Smaller organizations don't. And then there are also different states with different laws. Like in California, for example, it's basically required that supervisors get trained in sexual harassment. Whereas where I am in Georgia, I've never had, workplace sexual harassment training here. So there's variation, but it's very common. It's a common, preventative tool that organizations use to attempt to prevent sexual harassment, but also to be able to show evidence if they ever get sued that they, have in fact been attempting to prevent this from happening in their workplace.
So how is sexual harassment training conducted? I mean, what are some of the activities that go into those kinds of training efforts?
So there's variation, but I would say that the vast majority of people in this day and age get trained online. So it's fairly common for organizations. Basically, sexual harassment training is sort of proprietary. There's companies that create these trainings, and then organizations pay the company to provide these trainings to their employees. And so nowadays, it's most common that these trainings are online, and they'll be scenario based where, they'll basically go through what the organization's rules are about sexual harassment and then provide some possible scenarios one might face to try and, sort of give some advice about how you should respond if you end up witnessing sexual harassment or end up being a victim of it. And so that's sort of the most common. There are other formats. Some organizations, there's some companies that do like sort of theater troupe trainings where they actually hire actors to come in and play out sexual harassment scenarios. I've seen mock sort of courtroom sexual harassment trainings. So those are the sort of primary formats, but the most common one is an online training that people largely see as a bureaucratic necessity, and it sort of is not, necessarily particularly engaging. Sometimes there's a quiz at the end so that, the company is sort of making sure people are paying attention.
So the title of your paper implies that there might be a relationship between sexual harassment training and men's motivation to work with women. Why might there be a relationship, and what kind of relationship might it be?
Sure.
So theoretically, what are the possibilities before you started your study?
So I think I'll go back and I'll tell you how we got to this study, and then maybe that'll help sort of lay it out. For my dissertation many years ago, I was interested in understanding the effect of sexual harassment policy training on people's beliefs about men and women. And so basically, I conducted a number of studies using various methods to sort of try and understand how sexual harassment policy training affected people's gender beliefs. And in general, what I found in all of these studies was this unfortunate unintended consequence, which is that oftentimes sexual harassment policy training actually tends to reinforce traditional gender stereotypes and incite sort of like a backlash reaction, negative attitudes about women. And so that research, I've done it in a lot of different ways, and I sort of just kept finding that effect, which is unfortunate. So, I've continued to do work trying to understand sort of the mechanisms at play here, like why is it that happens, and so on. So fast forward some years after this research was conducted and the Me Too movement happened. And this was in 2017, when, you know, a lot of people were talking about sexual harassment and a lot of people were talking, you know, sort of naming and sort of socially stigmatizing, you know, those who perpetrated sexual harassment online. So at this time, the media was interested suddenly in my research. And so I got a lot of media, you know, calling me and wanting to find out more. And in particular, people, you know, what people wanted to know, that the media wanted to know, was, you know, why do we have this problem? Like we've been training people on sexual harassment for a long time, but it seems like there's still a lot of sexual harassment. And so, anyways, one of the questions that I kept getting asked by journalists was, you know, you seem like you're interested in these unintended consequences of training. Do you think it's possible that all this attention to the issue of sexual harassment is actually making men wary of working with women? So maybe men are hearing this and hearing about all of these people, you know, getting shamed online and are scared that maybe they'll accidentally be accused of sexual harassment, or, you know, or perhaps in some sort of act of vengeance on the part of a woman. And this would just lead to sort of a wide scale fear among men that they might not want to work with women as much to avoid being accused of sexual harassment. So I thought that was an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but I thought, well, we should find out. So I would say, I guess, to come back to answer your question, I think sort of the most obvious reason why people would be wary to be motivated, why men would be wary to work with women, would be that they're afraid that they'll be accused of sexual harassment. So yeah.
But so I see that now that you've said it. I'm wondering though, but when companies introduce sexual harassment sensitivity training, they're not doing it, I presume, to lead men to be wary of working with women. So isn't there a hypothesis on the other side that the training would make men either have no effect on their willingness to work with women or comfort, or maybe even make it more comfortable because they now know what the, you know, they feel maybe they would be informed. Before they were a little wary, like, oh, you know, what's going to happen because women haven't been in this workplace in these positions before, you know, but now they are, and now this gives me some guidance on how to. If I'm just trying to figure out, is it the assumption was simply one way, or was it that it could have gone either way in your
Yeah, I mean, going into the study, yeah, again, when the journalists asked me the question, I genuinely didn't know the answer because I could imagine it going either way. I certainly think there was a sort of cultural discourse rising out of the Me Too movement that was like, we're talking about this too much now. You know, this is going to lead to all these negative things, the backlash against women and so on. So that discourse was the sort of like, men, you know, be afraid, we're coming for you, the witch trial sort of thing. On the other hand, you know, what we also witnessed that I think maybe isn't quite as splashy in terms of, you know, media attention, is a lot more men were, you know, being made aware of the problem of sexual harassment, and, you know, were expressing, at least on surveys, concern, like, oh, we don't really want this problem in our workplace. So our question was really, okay, well, what, you know, given these sort of broad discourses at this current time, in this current cultural moment, you know, what effect is sexual harassment training going to have? And on the one hand, it could amplify these fears that women are out to get men, or it could make men feel better about their workplace and, you know, feel more at ease working with women, because now they sort of learn strategies for how to interact with women better. So yeah, we did genuinely go into this project, you know, thinking that it was possible that the training could decrease, increase, or have no effect on men's motivation to work with women.
So it seems like a challenging area to study because there's all these different types of training going on. And so what did you do to gain insight? And what was your study? How did you design your study?
Right. So we basically designed this study relying on the paradigm that I had used in my prior research when I was trying to figure out how sexual harassment training affected people's gender stereotypes. So we used basically experimental methods. So in experimental methods, we basically had people come into a lab, and we basically exposed one group to sexual harassment training, another group did not get this training, and then we measured their men's motivation to work with women. So that was sort of the basic design. And the way that we did this was we basically recruited undergraduates to come into the lab. This was for course credit, and we recruited only men. And when they came into the lab, we told them that they were going to be working on a decision-making task with a partner. And then we basically, they were either randomly assigned to be in what we call the policy intervention condition or the control condition. So in the policy intervention condition, they got this brief sexual harassment training. The training was basically developed from a real training for students it was like a training video for students, and we modified it, and we actually made it like we used the same text as this original training, but we put it into a PowerPoint slides where we had sort of men and women narrators alternate the text, because we wanted to be able to control for the gender of the trainer. So the training was short. It was like 4 minutes long, but it covered the sort of basics of what people get in these sorts of trainings. So it, basically defined sexual harassment, and gave a few examples of where it most often happens for students or occurs for students, and then provided some information about, where you could go on campus if you needed to report or get support in some way. So half the people in the study watched that training. We lied and told them that it was required because they were going to be working with a partner, and that was required of all, work at the university where you were working with a partner. So, and then in the control condition, we lied again, and we told them that the university now required that all students learn how to set up an ergonomically safe computer workspace, because there was sort of a rise in repetitive stress injury. So they watched a short video of the same length about setting up their computer workstation. And then once they watched this video, then that was like when the study supposedly started. So then our next goal was to see how, if there was a difference between those who had the training on sexual harassment and those who did not, and their motivation to work with a woman on this next task that they were supposed to be completing together.
So very elaborate design, but it seems like you thought of a lot of challenges and addressed them. So what did you find? What were the key findings from the analysis?
Okay, so I'll talk about the good news first, and then I'll talk about some of the bad news. So the good news, so one thing, and basically after they did these trainings, we then gave them information about some potential people that they could possibly partner with. And then they read some information about this person or multiple people. And then they evaluated them on a number of different characteristics. And then they actually chose which partner they wanted. So presumably, if sexual harassment trainings were doing really bad things, then we would find that the men would be much more likely to not choose a woman partner, to choose a man partner, and in the policy training condition. And that's not what we found. We found basically no difference. So whether they were exposed to the sexual harassment training or not, people were on average slightly more likely to select a woman than a man as their partner. So that's good news, in the sense that the training isn't having that negative unintended consequence. We also had them evaluate their potential partner on a variety of different ratings. Basically, one set of questions, were like, how well do you think you're going to work together as a team type questions. And we also found no difference on that variable. So that's the good news. So the less good news is that we also asked them to rate their partner with respect to how similar they felt they were to their partner. And in the sexual harassment training condition, they rated their female partner as more dissimilar to them than in the control condition. So this is actually fairly consistent with all the prior research of mine that I talked about, which is that the trainings do tend to sort of reify these notions of gender difference so that people see men and women as more fundamentally different after sexual harassment training. And I think that's because sexual harassment is sort of a gendered phenomenon, and it's talked about in a way that, you know, sort of reinforces this notion that men are perpetrators and women are victims of these sorts of things. And so even if the training doesn't say that, it's sort of like the cultural stereotypes that we have about sexual harassment. So we got that effect again, basically, in this study. The other sort of complicated thing we found is that we also randomly assigned the participants to either be working, they were told that they were either going to be working with a partner, and they would be either a leader or a subordinate, like a helper with this partner. And so they were either going to be sort of in the powerful position working with this partner or in the less powerful position. And we did find that those who'd been assigned to be leaders were more wary of working with a woman after the training than those who were assigned to be helpers. So when the men knew that they would be working with a woman who, you know, imagining that they might be working with a woman who was going to be leading them, who was going to be more powerful than them, the sexual harassment training actually made them more comfortable and less nervous about working with a woman. Whereas for the leaders, it was the opposite case. It sort of amplified their fears about working with a woman.
So taking the full set of findings, the ones that suggest the policy is not having negative side effects, and those showing some concerning side effects, how do you make sense of these findings? What do the findings say about how men may be responding to sexual harassment sensitivity training?
I guess, you know, I would say that with what we found, we can't say for sure. Like, you know, we don't really know what's happening, but I think we have some ideas about what might be happening. And I think one thing that might be happening is that sexual harassment training, the Me Too movement, all of this talk about these issues invokes a lot of uncertainty, some fear, some stereotypes, and it's sort of like a big swirling cultural discourse with a lot of competing messages. And these competing messages have good and bad effects. And so, you know, doesn't seem, at least with this study, to find strong evidence that the average undergraduate male in a one-time task where, you know, he's never really going to get to know this person very well or need to get to know this person very well, it doesn't really sort of invoke fear of having to work with a female partner. It's a fairly low bar, right? In the sense that, like, the stakes are low. I mean, the likelihood of being in a lab and being accused of sexual harassment are extremely low. And so, you know, in that case, this is good news in the sense that it doesn't seem to invoke that fear. But we do see some evidence of fear, which suggests that, you know, there is some extent to which these trainings and all of the messages that come with them, you know, do make people think about gender, make people think about what it means to work with a woman in ways that, you know, even if it doesn't make somebody sort of wary of working with the woman, it might, you know, sort of have more subtle effects on your comfort level, and at least on the extent to which you sort of see somebody as being similar or different than you, which is difficult when you're trying to sort of figure out how to reduce gender inequality in the workplace. You know, if the sort of efforts to do that also reify gender stereotypes and this notion of gender difference, then then that, isn't great news, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have training. It just means that we sort of have to think about how can we counter some of these stereotypes that so readily get triggered when we talk about gender.
So maybe this is the answer to the next question, but just in case it isn't, because you may have more to say, thinking about the results of the experiment, is there anything you would say to human resources officials or other company personnel concerned with assuring equity in the workplace? Other strategies they might consider, or things to worry about or be aware of, on the policy domain?
So I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. There are no easy answers to this problem, but I will say I think there are a couple things that that I can feel confident saying organizations should do. So one thing is, if we know, and I think we do at this point, that these sexual harassment trainings do tend to reify gender stereotypes. I think that, it's worth thinking about how we can create sexual harassment trainings that counter these stereotypes more explicitly. And that, does involve, because organizations tend to sort of hire out trainers, like it kind of involves the people who are in charge of training to rethink how they can make these trainings, a little bit less gender stereotypical. So that's one, I think, relatively easy thing that people can do. The other thing I guess I'll say is that one thing that happens in organizations is that when you have a problem like this, and particularly when it's a problem that if you don't handle it well, you'll get sued, and possibly be accused of discrimination. You definitely want to do, everything you can to make it look like you're trying to create an equitable workplace. And sexual harassment trainings, or trainings in general, are sort of a convenient tool in the toolbox for sort of making it look as if you're doing what you can to comply and is doing what you can to sort of, promote a gender equitable workplace. And so in that regard, like, fine, good, let's keep doing them. But we don't want to check the box on solving this issue with solely training, because training is just sort of one thing that we can do. And it's actually fairly easy for it to become the only thing that organizations do, because it is sort of easy to show. It actually costs a fair amount of money. It has some of that performative value of sort of showing your workers, showing the larger world that you care, and it's not enough. So I would say that organizations need to think about it as one tool in their toolbox rather than, the end of solving sexual harassment. And we know that, right? Because we'd have gotten rid of it by now if training was enough.
Well, Professor Tinkler, I want to thank you for doing this important work to sort of get into the guts of what's happening and how it may be operating, because that's going to deepen our understanding of the way the world works. And I want to express my appreciation for you coming on to share your research with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was fun to talk about.